welcome to another episode of Abletop, a series of videos where myself, Laura Kate Dale, and my lovely co-host Carrie Waterton talk about board game accessibility. This is the third video in a six-part series, and today we are going to be talking about visual accessibility in board games. So that's text clarity, iconography, colorblind considerations, things like tactile gaming, all that sort of stuff for people who might have various kinds of visual disabilities. Where do we want to start today talking about this?
Shall we start with text clarity and then we can work into the more colors and icons later?
I think text clarity is a really easy one to start with. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
very established standards we can talk about here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think my the big thing for me is like looking at dyslexia friendly style guides. The one by the British Dyslexia Association is my favorite because it not just goes into doesn't just go into fonts. It goes into formatting as well and layout, which I think
Yes.
is something that's incredibly important. Looking at not just what font are you using, but how are you laying that out on the page, and are you doing it in a way that's going to be accessible? Because it doesn't matter if you use the most accessible font in the world, if it is tiny or the spacing is terrible, or it's a color that you can't read, then
Yeah.
it's not going to help.
Yeah. So fonts is like where a lot of these conversations start, and
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of cases, it's as far as people think. And I think it is worth talking about dyslexia fonts because I think there's a couple of pitfalls that people fall into that have a cursory knowledge of the subject. So
Mm-hmm.
let's start with this one maybe. There is no one dyslexia friendly font that is going to work for everyone. And
Mm-hmm.
there is there is a lot more complexity to the conversation of dyslexia friendly fonts than use this one will solve all your problems. In video games where you can have multiple fonts available to people, we've sort of gotten that industry as far as like a lot of people are offering Open Dyslexic, which is a contentious font in that there are some people who have dyslexia who use this open source font and look at it and go, oh, that's fantastic, I find it so much easier to read. There are other dyslexic people who look at it and go, really cannot do that. Something about it just is jamming up my brain even more than standard text. And
Mm-hmm.
I think like the thing that's important to think about is like there are various approaches outside of like fonts that are designed to be deliberately dyslexia friendly that can sort of be part of how you think about dyslexia fonts. A good part of that is some people who are dyslexic find very standard fonts that they have seen in lots of places like Times New Roman counterintuitively find them the easiest to read with dyslexia because they are the fonts that they encounter most frequently out in the real
Mm-hmm.
world. Um, Sometimes the best thing to do is to just use simple sans serif fonts. Like, I know it gets mocked online, but Comic Sans is a font that like a lot of dyslexic people find a lot easier to read. Um, None of these answers is going to be a 100% perfect font choice for everyone, but I think it's worth looking at the arguments for each of these and being aware of their pros and cons when
Mm-hmm.
making your font choices. The big thing being don't use a weird custom font that's style over substance and that people have never encountered before. That is going to be your worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think like 100% everything you've just said there. There's a really interesting correlation in like research where like the fonts that were standard in like Microsoft Word documents across the ages become more and more like recognizable because like now it's I'm not going to mispronounce it, but Calibri, whereas before it was
Yeah.
Arial. So like there's correlation there between the thing that you're seeing most often, like you're saying. I think some things as well in terms of like the styles of fonts. You can have decorative fonts, that's okay, like for headings and things like that. And there's things like you should avoid all caps in like sentences and
Hmm.
paragraphs. The reason being is because the characters are all the same height. You're not using like the
Yes.
descender or like having the smaller characters like the O's and A's like not have the A center. So it makes it harder to tell those characters apart in an all caps thing. So I tend to suggest that we try to avoid all caps as much as possible. But headings is where you're going to be able to get away with things like that in the most thematic way. When it comes to like core rulebook text, like keeping the formatting
Yeah.
simple, keeping a nice font that is you're trying to avoid things like italics as well. Italics and underlines, big
Mm.
things for me where I'm like don't use that, use bold. If there's other things you can do, like a color that still maintains good contrast, then you can use that as a secondary way to highlight it. Um, and yeah, I think things like that. There was something else, and it's completely gone out of my mind. But yeah, I agree with you. I think a sans serif font, clear sans serif font, is a good place to start.
Yeah.
There are ways you can make your online PDFs have different layers of visibility. And if that's something that you
Yes.
do want to go down, you can have like a version where you can toggle on something like Open Dyslexic. Because as we say, some people find it really, really useful. And I've met people on both ends of the spectrum
Yeah.
of like, this is terrible, I can't
I'm
read this.
I'm on the side that finds it really helpful, which is really
Mm-hmm.
frustrating when I want to use it for projects and I know that there's a portion of the same community who are going to find it really unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, to your point of PDFs, like I think that's a really easy thing to offer where you could go like, look, go if the font that we have chosen in the printed rulebook is unhelpful for you, go on our website. You can find it in like 3 different other fonts that you can print out yourself to have a version you're going to find easier to read and reference. Something
Mm-hmm.
like that could go a long way to giving people the flexibility to do what's going to be easiest for them to mentally pass.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I'll talk about one last bit of text formatting that I really enjoy and fascinates me, which is left aligning paragraphs. Loads of people like to do
Mm,
the justified paragraphs, and the reason that that can be sometimes tricky is because it's inconsistent spacing between the words.
mm,
So the left aligned paragraph, not only have you got consistent spacing between the words, but your eye is also returning to the same starting point. Like I've seen some people write aligned paragraphs before, and I'm like, this is horrible. Please don't do this. But yeah, so that's one of the things as well. People, I'll say, oh, we should be left aligning this, and they always ask why. So that's a couple of the reasons why it could be helpful. But
yeah.
yes.
But as you say, like font isn't like the beginning and end of those kind of things. Like, are you making sure that that font is high contrast, that it is
Mm-hmm.
large enough, that it is like consistently applied? Um, Making sure that like you have frequent paragraph breaks so that you have places for
Mm-hmm.
someone to finish internalizing what they've just read before feeling like they need to move straight on. Like paragraph breaks can be really helpful for not just making a person zone out and completely not internalize what they're reading.
Mm-hmm.
That like all of these things do ultimately go into the readability of text for people who might struggle to take in written word.
Absolutely. And I think just a little note in terms of like those larger paragraphs. If there's something in there that's like important, again, we're
Hmm.
talking about like the keyword highlighting. Something that I've thought about before is like pre-written tabletop RPG adventures. If you've got like a big paragraph of like this is what's going on in the room, and like these are the things that are happening, and then you've got like a skill check in the middle of it that you're asking for people to do. If you're not able to like have a break in that paragraph or a way to like call that out more effectively, looking at how you can highlight that within that paragraph so someone reading through and delivering it can quickly pick out that information. So that also helps to break up those larger paragraphs too. Should we
Definitely.
chat a little bit about number orientation?
Yeah, do you wanna jump in on this?
Yes. So when I think of number orientation, one of the things that I think about the most is like a 6 and a 9,
Hmm.
both being the same thing but reversed. And there's a couple different ways that you can like show that orientation in terms of like I've seen there be like a full stop or a period after the number or like an underline on them and things like that. Um, and yeah, I think like that's something that should be considered in games as well, not just with numbers, but with any other characters that might be like
Hmm.
slightly less distinguishable from each other. So if we're thinking about like, um, I depending on the font, like a U and an N and stuff like that. Looking
Hmm.
at like, are there characters that when I look at this from a different angle, it's going to be hard to tell them apart? And so, is there something I can do there in terms of indicating what way it should be?
Yeah, I see a lot of this considered when you look at, say, something like a dice that like you
Mm-hmm.
are going to be rolling, and inevitably you can't predict its orientation. I don't see it considered so much in, say, text written onto the player board that is going to be viewed by some players from, the correct way up, some players from the side, some players upside down.
Mm-hmm.
That ability to read your text upside down is going to struggle when certain characters look like other characters when upside down or when sideways. And those same considerations of having like an underline or a dot aren't usually put onto boards, as you say, because like they're
Hmm.
like, oh, that's a static orientation. Surely that will be obvious.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. But you don't know what anybody's table is like. They might have like a super long bench as well, so you might be like looking at the
Hmm.
same angle as other people. It might be a round table. I've played board games on a massive round table before where no one could reach the middle. It was a thing that existed. Those kind of things. But yeah, I totally agree. Actually, on you talking about like viewing things from different orientations, this might be a nice segue into a little bit of the iconography stuff. So one of the things that
Yeah.
I was thinking about was the difference between skeuomorphic icons versus abstract icons. Skeuomorphism is a thing, it's in user experience design, but it's the idea of making something that is representative of like the real world, so it reduces the
Hmm.
learning barrier for someone. So for
Yeah.
example, on your desktop, your trash can that you have on your desktop
Yeah.
looks like a bin, because it's recognizable. Um, Versus something like an abstract set of icons. And I think one of the examples that I was thinking about with this was Calico and Sea Salt and Pepper have different ways of showing colors through icons.
Hmm.
Calico uses more skeuomorphic icons where they've got like a flower for pink and they've got a blueberry for blue, and things like that. And then Sea Salt and Pepper is using something called the color alphabet, which is really, really cool. It's a nice sort of resource. You can go and look it up online, and it's meant to be this very approachable, very easy to read language set. But some of those, when viewed upside down, look similar or the same to other ones. So, like, if you're
Hmm.
considering using abstract icons, or you're considering using that, making sure that there's something in terms of the orientation of the cards or components that you're putting on it to make sure that those are readable as well.
Definitely. Iconography is a really interesting one to start digging into for accessibility because one thing that I think a lot about with iconography is how easily and quickly and clearly can you explain a shape to someone else at the table and not have it mistaken for a different shape you might be describing? Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the things that comes up with games that have dice with like fictional runes on them as opposed to like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, the triangle has come up. I can instantly communicate a triangle to someone. I have language for that. This
Mm-hmm.
looks sort of like a U with a capital T in the middle, and a line across the center of that. Maybe I can recognize that icon, but can I communicate it in a way where someone else is instantly going to go, I know what you're describing?
Mm-hmm.
And that I think also ends up coming up in your sort of discussions of things like skeuomorphic icons versus abstract icons is can I instantly at any angle go as you say that's the blueberry, like I
Mm-hmm.
recognize what shape that is versus there is a not necessarily instantly available language I'm going to have to apply to describe this.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting what you're saying there about like the runes. In some games that I've made before, I really enjoy, or like escape rooms, I really enjoy those puzzles where you've got like the languages in two different places and you have to have the people
Yeah.
communicate like, and you end up with amazing, fantastic concoctions of like, it looks like a guy with a
Yeah.
hat, but also there's
I
something there.
That's the thing is like when that is the intended challenge and you know that that is deliberately going to be
Hmm.
challenging. I think that's great. I think of things like the video game Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes, which has
Yes.
several games where like someone in the VR headset is seeing a symbol and trying to describe it to someone not in VR looking at the manual. um but it's one of those things, don't have that be a barrier in your game if it is not an intended barrier. Like,
Hmm.
don't accidentally fall into that being a barrier that players are gonna be challenged by.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. I think like so like one example was there are some of the dice faces on Dice Forge, which we talked about before. And
Mm,
one of them they use a lot of really kind of complex icons for their faces, and most of them make sense once you start to learn the way that they're like communicating it. And then there's this big one which is just this big like it looks like a blue wax seal with a question mark in the middle of it. And every
Hmm.
single time I'm like, what does this mean? I need to go look this up. Or they've got ones that have got like boars on it, as in like the animal, like a wild boar and stuff like that. And so having a reference there for what do these dice faces mean again, they can get quite complicated. Um, Go for it.
Yeah. And I think one place where that becomes really important is when we're talking about things like colorblind accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is
Mm-hmm.
slightly jumping around, but you want your ideally, I think you want your icons in your game to be to be as identifiable as instantly as someone who has color vision would recognize a color on a die face. I think that level of I'm instantly like I know which one that is without having to stop and think and cross
Mm-hmm.
reference makes for a much smoother gameplay flow experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the more that you require someone to like have to stop and internalize what does this abstract thing mean, the
Mm-hmm.
more you are putting barriers into the smoothness of play.
Absolutely. I'm a massive nerd on this front because my one of my projects I did at uni was I made like a fictional board game or pieces for it. And one of the things I did was like creating icons for a dice that was supposed to be like a dice that had different bone symbols. And then I like had all of these sheets where I'd rotated all of the different icons to different angles. And I was like, do any of these look like each other at different angles? But things like that. I think something I find quite interesting as well. I was thinking about Elder Sign, and they've got sort of two versions of icons. They've got on the cards themselves like a skull icon. It's got quite a bit of art around it, or like a scroll that's also like really colored in. And then they've got the simplified versions of those icons that exist on the dice. One thing they have with orientation is they've got like little numbers as well. So it's like, is it a one scroll or a two scroll or
Mm.
something like that? But I found that was really interesting in terms of like they've got the correlation and they've got like a more artsy version over here, and then they've got the simpler version over there. Which again, we're talking about being identifiable. You can be like scroll, magnifying glass, skull.
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
No, yeah, I think you're absolutely nailing this. Yeah, was there anything else we wanted to talk about on iconography while we were on it still?
Oh, something I did want to talk about was the idea of universal components. So,
Oh yes, yes.
yeah. So with board games, if you've got text on your board games, then one of the things that you will have to consider is localization. Whereas
Mm.
if you have just icons on your components, then you don't need the localization because you're not translating any text. So something like Fort, again, we've talked about that a couple times, has a big card that gives you the overview of what all of the icons mean, and then it means that only really that card and the rules and the player boards need to go through localization and translation. All the cards themselves are almost like language agnostic. And it's not just about the localization cost, but it's also like if someone has a low reading level or if they're not very confident reading and using the visual elements to be able to play the game. And you can see this again in something like Codenames Pictures. I love the way that
Mm.
Codenames have done different variations of their game, and the picture one just opens it up because suddenly it's much more visual and you're not relying on someone reading and also understanding what the word means in like the standard version
Yeah.
of Codenames.
I, I will add one thing on this, which I think is an important consideration that I've seen once or twice come up, just unintentionally, is you need to do a little bit of legwork to check that your iconography sometimes is universal, in as much as making sure that the meaning of certain icons translates across
Mm-hmm.
locations. It's not a particularly common thing that's going to come up, but for example, like the difference between like a thumbs up and how a thumbs up is perceived versus say how using your index finger and thumb together to make a sort of okay symbol. Some of
Mm-hmm.
these are not as universal across regions in terms of their meaning as you might imagine, and it is worth checking that that kind of iconography you're using is consistent in its meaning,
Mm-hmm.
and that is still something visual that might need taking into account for localization.
Yeah, absolutely. I know my partner did as part of his uni course. He was working on something with Steam China, and there were like interesting things there with like the color red and four-sided shapes and things like that. So yeah, have a look at sort of and making sure, as you say, that those things are going to be able to be translated universally.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Other stuff on visual. I think this is going to be one of the big things that everyone imagines we're going to talk about when we talk about visual accessibility. Print size, making
Mm-hmm.
sure that things in your board game are big enough that someone who might struggle with reading small things can instantly visually follow them. And like, there's a
Mm-hmm.
couple of obvious ways this comes into account. Um, icons. Are your icons big enough so that like you can make out small details? Because obviously, if you're trying to work out the difference between a circle and square, they're fairly different. But if you're looking at like a diamond versus a rhombus, maybe having that large is going to make it easier to pick those differences out.
Absolutely. Something, poor Celestia. I feel bad, but Celestia, the icons on its cards are another pet peeve for me in terms of they're really small and some of them are really complicated, especially with the
Mm.
items that have like, you're going to be doing this to the dice, and they've tried to communicate that in the icons, and they're tiny on the card. And it's really, really, really hard sometimes just to like quickly understand which card it is that I have. And there's so much space on this massive card. The only other thing that's on it is art. And I'm like, could they not have just made these a little bit bigger, please? So that I can
Yeah.
more easily differentiate them.
Yeah, agreed. Again, speaking of making proper use of the space on your cards available, make your text big.
Mm-hmm.
Increase the size of your text. The number of board games I've known where there is like a set size text box, but no matter how much or little text they have, they'll always use the same size. And I'm like, if you've got the ability, maybe increase the size. If there's less text on this one, just make it a little easier to read if you have the space to do so. Because text size is
Mm-hmm.
such a big factor to legibility.
Yeah, it really is. Like if you have the space to, even if it's on only some of the components, like yeah, if you're thinking about maybe right, you've got simpler cards earlier on the game that might have less text. Having those bigger is fine. Like you can have a little bit of inconsistency in the components for the sake of readability.
Hmm.
But yeah, and one of the things that I really liked about Wormspan, which I think we mentioned before, was the fact that they took the flavor off of the cards.
Hmm.
And so that meant that they've got more space on there to have larger text explaining what each
Yeah.
of the dragons does. And you've got the flavor text in a massive big dragon book, and it's great because it reminds me of those big dragonology books that I used to get when I was a
Yeah.
kid that I was obsessed with. But so it's great. You're not missing out on the flavor, and it's there as like that optional thing if you want it. And you've still got the gorgeous art of the dragon to kind of give you that experience as well. But it's
Yeah.
just little sacrifices for readability and usability over flavor, I think is really important.
Yeah, there's an example that we've not got it written down on a list, but it's one we talked about between recordings the other week.
Mm-hmm.
There's a game recently me and my wife got called Daybreak, I think it's called, that does something really interesting on its cards, which is that every card has a QR code, nice small QR code, that when you scan it will take you to one of the things it does is it takes you to like some flavor for the card and how it works, and some rulings information about it on the card so that you can like solve rulings problems. But I look at a solution like that and go, something like that of just a QR code on your card, if you cannot accommodate for text size legibility, that's like you scan the QR code and now the text is on someone's phone so they can blow up the text size manually. Like,
Mm-hmm.
to a size that is legible for them. It's not ideal, but I feel like that wouldn't be the worst workaround in the world, is every card has a quick, easy scannable that lets someone look at the text larger on their own device.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or even like screen readers as well. Like I think that the
Yeah,
QR
yeah,
codes would have such a massive impact in terms of assisted tabletop gaming. I
yeah,
think like yeah, everybody would like it would be great to have cards that were braille and that were tactile. But I think we'll
mm,
talk a little bit about this in terms of the practicality of that and the implication on like production costs. But something
yeah,
like QR codes that you can scan and again companion apps that we kind of mentioned before that can help you to like this is what you've got in your hand, this is the stuff that you have in front of you, and you can have you can have one earbud in, or you can have bone conductive headphones on so you can still hear everybody at the
Yeah.
table, but you're getting that information so you can still engage and play. I think I was fascinated when you sent this to me. I was immediately obsessed because I've been trying to
Yeah.
do something like this for a while and figure out how small can I get these QR codes, like
Uh,
how
the
well can this
answer is
fit?
surprisingly small. The Daybreak ones
Yeah.
are remarkably small, and they scan really well for something that small.
Mm-hmm.
Daybreak's not a perfect execution. I'd rather the rulings information it give you be above the flavor text, but that's a
Mm-hmm.
little quibble ultimately for what I think that sort of works as a proof of concept for.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also on print size, the alternative is just to have a larger version of your game that accounts for larger text size.
Yes, absolutely. So like the example that I think of is we got the Ticket to Ride expansion, and it
Hmm.
has larger tickets and larger trains on it. I think we kept the larger tickets because they helped me in terms of being able to see the board more clearly. But I gave the larger
Hmm.
trains to my parents because
Yeah.
they're older than me and the smaller cards are sometimes a bit more difficult. So it's like here you can have these and you can use these. But something like the Tiny Epic games, they, as we said
Yeah.
before, they're super compact. They are tiny, and their
Yes.
cards can be really small. And like that is
Hmm.
obviously their USP.
Yeah.
But like yeah, it's
There,
it
there
is a
are
sacrifice.
it is
Mhm.
unfortunate because there are several of the Tiny Epic games where I'm like, this is lovely. I only ever played this at home. I would have paid for a larger version of this that was a little less fiddly. Because
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
the fact that it's tiny isn't always why I want to play it, and I know that that's suggesting printing an entire separate version of a game that contradicts its own USP. I know, but if there's no
Mhm.
reason your game has to be tiny,
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
it possible to make a bigger version?
Yeah, I think they're really cute for what it's worth, and I really do
Yeah,
love and respect the fact that I can have like several of them taking up the same space on my shelf as like a
yeah.
calico or
Oh,
something. Like,
there are
but
several that have stayed permanents in my collection, like Tiny Epic Mechs, Tiny Epic Zombies.
mm,
We've had a lot of fun with, but they are tiny because the selling point is they're tiny, not because
mm-hmm.
that is necessarily the best gameplay experience they could have been.
Yeah, I like the Tiny Epic Dinosaurs one was pretty good. That's been one of my favorite ones, and Tiny Epic Dungeons was fantastic. I loved
Mm,
seeing that, and I was actually quite surprised by the amount of table space that that one took up once you actually got everything out and like onto the
yeah.
table. Like those games be small but mighty. Um, but yes, if you have the luxury of like looking at, if being tiny isn't your USP, if you have the luxury of like a little extra in your production cost, can you go up a size in cards to be able to accommodate larger
Mm,
text size or larger icon size and things like that? Or can you do something like Ticket to Ride has done or Codenames has done with Codenames XL, where you can have sort of expansions or components that are more approachable for people who might need those larger components?
yeah. Um, is this a good time for us to talk about tactile gaming elements?
Yeah, I think so. I think we can.
Yeah.
We touched a little bit
I,
on like yeah the production costs and
I,
stuff.
I'm
Um,
curious to hear about this because you apparently have a little bit of insight on this one.
yes. So as a bit of background, my partner and I have been making board games since 2016. Just as like our own little fun board games, but we did several times try to go down the route of like getting them published or getting them made.
Hmm.
And what we discovered is that production costs in board games are ridiculous. Like
Yes, they are.
they are they are and like there's a reason that board games are really expensive. It's because their production
Yeah.
costs are so high, and it's every little thing from like deciding like what kind of varnish you want to like okay, is this size of all the sizes that's going to fit in this size of box, or do I need to go up a size of box? All that kind of stuff. The production costs just kind of like increase quite a lot.
Yeah.
So it's very fascinating. But it does mean that so the RNIB store has a specific section for board games where they have lots of tactile things like Braille, Scrabble, a tactile version of Ludo. Bless you. Um, and it makes sense why there is like a bespoke dedicated space in like RNIB or other like blind charities for providing those kind of tactile games, because the practicality of, like, we've talked about dual layer punch boards, and let's
Mm,
take Monopoly. You could do a dual layer punch board with a Monopoly board so that you'd be able to like tell where all of the different spaces
yeah.
were, but now you have potentially doubled the cost of producing the board because you've got two layers of punch board as opposed to just one. So there's a lot in terms of like, okay, how much can you do with what you have? Are there things that you can do? We've talked about using the reverse side of the Frosthaven cards for strategy guides. Are there other things that you can do with the reverse side of components to be able to increase their readability, and things like that? So, yeah, I think tactile gaming is fascinating, and I really love a lot of the work that's been put into it. Hand to Hand Wombat did a fantastic
Mm,
panel at GDC where they talked about how they made it so that it could be completely playable by the blind. I've played it with sightless combat before as well, so I know
mm,
it can. I know it works. I know it can happen. And yeah, they did things like they had little raised dots on each of the pieces so that you can count how many they are, and try and like stack the towers that way. Um, but if you're lim- there are limits in terms of the production stuff that you can do, and that's probably why we don't
yeah.
see a lot more tactile gaming accessibility in standard games.
Yeah. There's a lot of considerations for things like if your game is particularly text heavy, Braille takes up a lot more space than written text usually does, and that sort of will necessitate increasing sizes of components.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you have issues with if you're using something like Braille as your main way of communicating information, that is going to necessitate in a competitive game certain things being a little more obvious about what a Braille using player is planning to do. In that,
Mm-hmm.
there is a difference between using Monopoly as an example, as you brought up before,
Mm-hmm.
maybe glancing at the board to see what spaces you're maybe thinking of buying versus feeling the board and sort of assessing what you're planning that way. Is going to have uneven amounts of information about player plans being communicated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you have things like um, unseen components and like the fact that if you are reaching into a bag to pull components out, someone who is feeling tactile components is going to have more information about what they're pulling out potentially than someone who can't.
Mm-hmm.
And none of these are reasons that you can't do a tactile adaptation of a game, but these are things you have to consider about like would Braille be a good fit for the mechanics that are on show here, or is there
Mm-hmm.
better ways of making something adaptable, such as we kind of brought it up a minute ago, like the idea of having QR codes on cards for assisted play.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as you say, having something like bone conductive earphones on so that like you can still hear the rest of the table, but no one can hear what you're listening to. Scan a card, hear a text to speech narration of what that card's information is.
Mm-hmm.
Might be more practical than a larger adapted version of the card with Braille in certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a case of consideration. And there are places where you can look at your components and go, is there something more I can do for tactility here? Like,
Mm,
if you look at, well, the Flamecraft food tokens, the deluxe edition
yeah.
tokens, are all different shapes, and it's like that's fantastic. By default, by design, they are different shapes, and that's something that's quite can be quite easy to do with punchboard tokens. If you've got different
Mm,
tokens, are they larger for like different currencies? Like if you've got like a 1, a 5, and a 10, or are they slightly different shapes for different types of resources? So there's things
mm,
there that you can do when you're thinking about your production. Like you don't have to just make all of your tokens like
yeah.
circles.
And you can also, I think about design elements in terms of can you make your game inherently playable without the necessity of something like tactility for blind players? Like, for example, is your game perhaps a cooperative game with open hand information? I
Mm-hmm.
think of something like Kim Joy's Magic Bakery, a game that is about making little recipes for animals in the woods by picking up or trading with other players ingredients that you have, and that you are cooperatively trying to collect the things you need to make these recipes. That is a game that you could theoretically play completely open-handed, share information between each other about, like, okay, well, you've currently got these, I've currently got these, okay, what's currently out in the shop, yeah, I'll have one of those, and have someone hand you a component based on that.
Hmm.
There are games that kind of lend themselves more to having a sightless player and a sighted player playing together. You can work around lack of visibility, and that's not
Hmm.
necessarily something that like every board game is going to be able to inherently do, but it might be worth thinking, is my game close to being playable that way, and could I then make tweaks to get it to that point?
Absolutely. I 100% agree with all of that. Like, as you say, an open state of play, like where you can have people that are all like able to communicate what's going on.
Hmm.
Like yeah, and then that does mean that there's like less of a barrier in terms of like having to listen to something or having to feel specific components. That hopefully, as long as it's done well, could still afford a player without sight a lot of agency over like the actions that they're taking. So yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Something else I
Um.
would say quickly, just because it's actually right in
Yeah.
front of me. One of the things that you can do if you have half an hour and know how to Google Blender tutorials like I do, is you can also make little 3D printable things. So this is a tactile
Oh.
dice that I made.
Oh, that's lovely.
It's very cute. I enjoy it a lot. And I did a little Braille version as well. And so these are letterboxed so that you can tell the orientation of the numbers. Um, so
Oh.
so yeah, don't. We won't talk about balance, but no dice is 100% balanced anyway. But if there's
No,
something
but
where you think actually I could make a resource like and make it freely available that someone can 3D print if they have the resources to, then that's also a way to kind of consider making optional tactile versions of components for your players.
definitely. Um, so yes, other visual elements to talk about. Contrast. This is an important thing. This is something that we came up with. We had these discussions when sorting out the visual elements for this show. Making sure that you have proper contrast ratios between elements to make sure that things are clearly visible from each other.
100%. It's a little bit easier to do in video games because there's a lot of really great tools for analyzing color contrast. One of the
Hmm.
big things that will be of note in printed components is that printing is typically a lot darker than what shows up on your
Yeah.
screen. So there needs to be, if you have a whole bunch of like Pantone swatches, you should be able to look at them in front of you and see, okay, is this red actually going to come out the way that it looks like it's going to on the screen, or do I need to do
Yeah.
something slightly different? But this is also why prototyping your components is really helpful because, yeah, I've done it before. I've especially one of the things I found, and this is more of a decorative element when I've been making board games, is I've done like a repeating pattern for the back of a card, and I've set something to a certain level of opacity because I think that that will be nice, and then it prints, and then it's actually way darker than I expected it to come out, and
Yeah.
it looks really bad, and then I need to like rejig that in the file. So yeah, thinking about how is this contrast gonna go from being on
Yes.
these digital files to actually physical is really
You
important.
cannot assume that something that you checked with a digital contrast checker will still pass contrast standards once printed, and you have to
Mm-hmm.
go out of your way to double check that that's still the case.
Absolutely. I think that the digital contrast checkers are a great way to do initial checks. And what I would
Hmm.
do is I would like, instead of using the values that they recommend, I would bump those up a little bit
Yes.
when you're doing, like, when you're checking your files that you're going to print. That's a good way that I've found to sort of work around it.
Give
Um,
yourself some leeway.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. But yeah, I think we mentioned things like Sushi Roll, Go, Party. They all
Yeah.
have like really big, nice, chunky, clear icons. Again, there's another example of the way that they translate to dice in Sushi Roll and the way they're
Hmm.
simplified there. Um, and what's interesting about those dice as well, if I remember correctly, because the dice are different colors, they use different inks for the different colors of dice to ensure that there's like better contrast. I might be lying about that. I will check that.
um, but yeah, other areas where like contrast is important outside of say your card design and printing. Um, so many games will have all of their miniatures be the same color, be that all plain wooden miniatures or plain grey plastic minis, which can be really hard at a glance to distinguish from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And there are workarounds for that. You've got games. I think Scythe is one of these where like your minis are metal and grey, but you can have coloured rings that you place around the base of them. So like, okay, there's at least a splash of colour to differentiate them at a glance. It's not a perfect solution, but it at least gets something that's a little less that grey versus that grey that I'm trying to distinguish. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in a perfect world, if you've got the financial ability to do so in your production run, printing things in different colours so that at a glance that's not the same as that can go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. I found that the ink washed minis have been really helpful actually. That's kind of like an
Mm,
in-between step of taking something that's completely just plastic grey and instead of it being color, the ink washed ones make the darker areas a lot more darker and helps the contrast
mm,
pop, and that has helped me visually to be like those are definitely different things. But I have sort of like a better level of vision than some other players do. Um,
mm.
Color rings, as you say, are not a perfect solution, but I think also a lot of the minis that you see have like flat, plain bases that they're standing on. And I
Yeah.
think that you could do something on those bases as some kind of like, again, a tactile thing, like whether it's a tactile icon or something that could help distinguish it. And also what that could then do for other people. Say, for example, you've got, here's your set of these faction of minis, and they've got like a triangle on their bases, like between their feet, and this faction has a star between their bases. Is now, if someone wants that distinction, instead of having to paint the whole mini, they can just paint those icons.
Mm.
Like even just painting those like white so that there's greater contrast between the base and the face of that icon. It can really, that can be like a much more approachable way. Because I know we've got Monumental, which is a great game with amazing miniatures that I've been desperate to paint, but it is overwhelming the amount of them that are there. And in terms of just like if there was something quick that I could do as a player, if I know my friends are coming around who
Mm.
are colorblind and we might want some more assistance rather than just the colored rings, providing something like that, like a three-dimensional icon to be able to
Yeah.
put an approachable level of making this different.
Yeah, I really like that as an idea actually. I think that's a great point. So yeah, last few things to talk about in terms of visual stuff this week. We talked a couple of places here and there about colorblind accessibility. One of the most important things when considering trying to make your game accessible for any kind of vision issues, be it being low vision, colorblind, etc., is double coding your information, making sure that information is conveyed in more than one way.
Mm-hmm.
The obvious version of this you see a lot in colorblind considerations is don't just communicate information via color. Maybe like, oh, I've got to. What's the example I'm thinking of? The video game Among Us has a wire cutting mini game where the wires are colored, but they're also different patterns along them, so that if you can't see the color, you can go, oh, it's the polka dot wire, it's the diagonal forward slash wire. Um, Making sure that you have like at least a second way that you are conveying information that will help identify what's what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And this can go as far as like I've seen things in board games where it's like the red cards and the blue cards and the green
Mm,
cards. And it's like, is there something else that you can do on these other than just those colors? Whether
yeah.
it's if you have a piece of art, is there something you can do behind that art as the background to be like the green one has leaves or something. Again, it can be
Yeah.
abstract, it can be skeuomorphic, it can be whatever. But dual coding, as you say, yes, it should be something that you're thinking about and try and do it as something that is bigger and obvious. Namiju is
Mm,
a really great game. I love it, and they've got some colorblind accommodations in there in terms of they've got different fish and they have little icons on them. The icons are teeny, teeny, tiny. And so I would love it if there was a more obvious sort of dual coding element to that. Um,
yeah, that's the thing. Is like dual coding is great, but it can't be a just barely there element. It has to be again, I said this earlier, it needs to be as obvious as if I was to look at a card and go, yeah, I instantly know what color that is. It needs to
Hmm.
be a very, you glance at it and you can tell the second way that information is coded just as easily, I think is important.
Absolutely. Looking at there's a really interesting article that was on the differences between like Wingspan and Wormspan. And in
Mm.
Wingspan you've got the different power colors, so you've got like pink and blue and brown. And then in Wormspan they made icons instead for like this is what happens when your little adventure man goes over it, or this is what happens when this card is played. And they're using those icons. They've actually removed the color from there, so they've just used that as a kind
Mm.
of direct replacement. But it's something that dual coding is so easy to do if you think about it at the very beginning. If you don't think
Yes.
about it and you leave it to the end, you end up with having to slap things on that maybe don't make sense and can't be as like
Yeah.
naturally incorporated. But there are some really good examples of just like nice native dual coding. Um,
Yeah. Examples I like, we talked about this game the other week, Canvas, that game about
mm,
you're trying to match colors but also shapes and patterns and things to win various awards. All of the things there are communicated by like, sure, that's the red space, but it's also got a different kind of outline on it, and it's always in this position, so you know
hmm
where it is, and it's got this kind of pattern on it. Okay, well now we're trying to work out circles or squares, and everything has distinct iconography but consistent rules that can be used
hmm
to take a game that is like on its surface very much about colors and make it completely devoid from actually needing to know what the colors are.
Yeah, 100%. A canvas is a fantastic example because, like, yeah, at the bottom of the card, you've got those five swatches and they're always in the same order. And so it's
Yeah.
really, really easy. The other thing that I love about canvas is that their little ribbons all are different shapes. So again, it's
Yes.
another tactile component where it's different shapes as well as like the red ribbon, the purple ribbon, the blue ribbon. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's for a game that is about art, it's really really well considered for like being able to be color agnostic. So I
Yeah.
loved that. Yeah. Something that I did want to talk about a little bit, and we've touched on this in previous episodes about how board games are made up of intentional barriers, or sometimes there's something that you just can't do
Yes.
about it. Sagrada. I love Sagrada. It's one of my favorite games. Um, but there is no coding for the color matching aspect of it because it's all about rolling the dice and then putting the right color of dice into the right places. They can't be adjacent and all this sort of thing. Um, and I was a terrible human being, and I did get my very colorblind friend to play it with us, and it was a sad time. But and like there are solutions for it that I can think of, like okay, some people might think about like what you can do different opacities of dice. If you want to do different
Hmm.
colors, you can look at different opacities as well. But with Sagrada, part of the theming of this game is you're building a stained glass window. So those dice need to have that level of transparency in order to fit that theme. And I think that that's okay. The only other way that I can try and think of making those dice dual coded is by changing the pip shapes. So some are circles,
Hmm.
some are squares, some are triangles. But again, that falls into like a massive production uptick in terms of having to have now bespoke dice for different parts. So yeah, I think like it is something you're going to run into where this isn't accessible and you know that it's not accessible, but as long as you're transparent about like this is something that wasn't able to be done, it's more about communicating those both intended and unintended barriers, and just being like we
Yeah.
did think about this, we have considered this.
Yeah, there's an example on our list for this week that I think is a really good example of like a game I love that is deliberately about being visually kind of inaccessible. Micro Macro Crime City is a
Mm-hmm.
game that is basically just a Where's Wally style map with like hundreds of people running around a city, but you're trying to solve these crimes by like finding a person and then finding them somewhere else along their journey and finding like trying to track them through this very dense city of very small figures that you're looking for minute details to recognize that's the same person you saw earlier and follow them around this map. It is a game entirely about very little details and very small
Mm-hmm.
details and throwing huge amounts of visual stuff at you to sort through and process. That is a game that would not work if it was not visually overwhelming and made up of lots of tiny, very specific details. And,
Mm-hmm.
like, even in a game like that, it's not to say that there is no way that you could make it more accessible. You could offer people the ability to print their own version at a larger size, for example, and that might help. And, there are things you could do, but sometimes a game will inherently be about barriers that will come up against visual accessibility.
I mean, the truth of it is that games are made up of barriers. It's how we
Yeah.
create challenge. Like, and if they don't exist, it's not a game. It's just an experience. So like, yeah. But as you say, that is exactly the barrier that's there. Micro Macro Crime City does include a little magnifying thing, which is a very nice addition.
It's not.
But
I don't find it particularly actually helpful in use. It's. My opinion is it's a nice thought. It's not really a very functional magnifying glass.
it was a cute idea. It works for some people. Like, yeah, I also just prefer to because sometimes the movement of it gives me a little bit motion sickness in terms of it will warp
Yeah,
things a funny way, and
it
then I'll just be like, ooh, no.
it warps toward the edges too easily for such a small thing. It's very easy to not be in its sweet
hmm
spot. But
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
the thought was there of, is there something we can include that might make it more accessible? And I
hmm
appreciate that line of thinking about accessibility.
Yes, exactly. And I also like how in the game itself, it's got a couple of different ways that you can play through the crimes. It's like you can either go
Mm.
in like no hints and just try and get through the whole thing like by yourself and then go through it after, or you can have someone acting as a little bit of like a games master who's there and who's able to see what the next part of the puzzle is and can maybe give you hints or some guidance and stuff like that.
Mm.
So they have like different ways of doing it. But yes, I agree with you totally. It's all about visual overwhelm. It's one of those games that I get super hyper fixated on, like hyper focused on, and I'm like,
Yeah.
yes, and trying to find the little stories and the little people, and then I come out of it and I go, oh god, that was actually quite a big like brain workout and visual workout in terms of processing all of that.
Yeah, you'll
Um,
have the, like, I spent 20 minutes getting nowhere and then suddenly, oh, there they are, there they are, there they are, here it's going.
yes, yes, exactly. So no, so yeah, that's a really cool example, and I think it was worth bringing up for like visual stuff. Do we have anything else that we want to talk about in visual
I
accessibility
think
for board
I
games?
think that was everything we had down for today for the visual episode. So given that we're coming up on that hour, should we start to wrap up for this one?
Yes, yes, we can do.
Lovely.
I think we did very well today.
I think we got quite a lot in with our hour there. So yeah, I'm Laura. I can be found at Laura K Buzz pretty much everywhere that people show up on the internet. Carrie, is there anywhere that you want to point people at?
You can try and find me on Blue Sky. I don't post stuff very often, but I do check it.
Thank you everyone for watching. We will be back in another week with our next episode, episode 4. We will be talking about cognitive accessibility. This is one I've been looking forward to. I think this one's going to be great.
I
Thank
think
you
it was
everyone
gonna
for
be so
watching.
much.
Thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back soon. Goodbye.